Hello, this is John Willis. This is Introduction to DevSecOps. It's an OpenShift Commons briefing. I am Senior Director of a new team called the Global Transition Office, and I can be reached at jwillis@redhat.com. So, when we talk about DevSecOps, the origin of it is Shannon Leitz over at Intuit in 2015 pretty much coined the term, but created a website called DevSecOps.com. And in there, she started a blog, but more importantly, she sort of drove this idea of what she called the DevSecOps Manifesto. Now, there was some sort of prior art before. There was a rugged, like Josh Corman and a few other people doing a rugged manifesto, very similar, but this was really the beginning of sort of attaching security directly with, literally sort of, using the name DevOps. And if you look, we won't go into this too detail. I'm hoping that as we sort of, sort of explore this community opportunity in the SIG, OpenShift Commons SIG, we can explore a lot of things we're going to talk about in the next 10 or 15 minutes that I really want to sort of get the community involved. But the idea of leaning in, if you look down there, leaning in over saying no, right? Like, embracing lean ideas and sort of all the things that we've really sort of come to know and love in DevOps. Data and security science over fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? Like using sort of science, like a lot of the stuff that we've seen in DevOps would accelerate, using science now to prove sort of or to correlate our outcomes, right? So using those same sort of methods that we've enjoyed in DevOps, same thing. Open contribution and collaboration over security-only requirements. So one of the sort of issues, particularly in large cap corporations, Fortune 1000, Fortune 5000, you find that a lot of these sort of security demands are for some sort of global policy office or governance risk, and they're sort of mandated by books that people don't really see. So this idea that we're really going to sort of treat security as just part of this sort of contribution collaboration that we've been doing very reasonably successful, I would say very successful in DevOps. Consumable security services with APIs over mandated security controls and paperwork, right? You'd be alarmed at how many large financial institutions today are, best case, their sort of policy guidelines are in, spreadsheets. I mean, massively, I'm 300 column spreadsheets. So sort of moving into this century with how we sort of treat security, very much like we do everything, and more importantly, I'll be talking one of the conversations I really want to explore in this sort of opportunity, this SIG is policy, governance, risk, and compliance. So not just sort of DevSecOps that applies to DevOps, and we'll get more into that. Business-driven security scores over rubber-stamp security, so scorecards. Red and blue team exploit testing over relying on scans or theoretical vulnerabilities. This is where, sort of the incident or the sort of preemptive model that we see in some sort of DevOps, or just, the way people do it, they'll scan libraries and feel like they're safe, or they'll just do sort of incident resolution or postmortems. But this idea is you actually start to create sort of an attack vector from internal, like a red team. In fact, Shannon, last time I talked to her, I think runs like somewhere in 60 or 70 person red team at Intuit, right? They're like that, that's crazy, right? 24/7 proactive security monitoring, and overreacting after being informed of an incident, right? Again, see, being proactive. Shared threat intelligence. This is really important. Shannon says this a lot, and you can tell already that she's pretty much been my mentor on. We're actually working on a DevSecOps handbook. I'm actually co-author of a DevOps handbook, but one of the things she talks about is how intelligent the adversaries are, and how equipped they are, and how they use the tools. And so when I'm presenting to a large audience, and I'll ask the audience, how many people in this room work for a financial institution? And depending on the venue, maybe a third of the room will raise a hand, and I'll say, well, how many of you who have your hand raised right now actually share intelligence and have some sort of cadence of communication about the adversaries, and every hand goes down, right? And what Shannon likes to point out, and I point out too, is the adversaries are very collaborative. They're very DevOps. They are sharing information on your institutions at a rapid rate. They have all the tools that you have. So again, I think the opportunity here is to really, and I'm finding over the last couple of years more companies that would be less inclined to, like 2 or 3 banks to share information. In fact, I worked on a project early this year where we had 3 banks on an automated governance project, and I'll be writing some more stuff about that. So there's sort of a new model now where I think a lot of these institutions that usually would never share information, they look at sort of threat sharing and shared intelligence as, table stakes. And then finally, compliance operations over clipboards and this. And like I said, this was sort of the original manifesto. Principles, that Shen laid out in that original blog post are really 5 principles: a customer-focused mindset, right? And that seems sort of platitudish or obvious, but the idea that sort of opportunity that, in fact, this year, DevOps is 10 years old from its name, as it was coined by Patrick Dubois. But and ultimately, it was between sort of all sorts of groups. But that made sort of DevOps malleable for customer focus. But what we found as we were going into 2015, 16, and I would say DevSecOps really started kicking in gear in around 2017, that we still had that security sort of in the silo, and they were sort of different groups and different organizational structures. Scale security. What this really means is, you have to take security out of those sort of silos and embrace the things that are happening, like DevOps and like Lean and Agile. There's a great book called, Agile Security, right? And objective criteria. This is about outcomes, right? So one of the things we've done really well in DevOps is sort of started moving and shifting to sort of outcome-based thinking. You're thinking about DevOps metrics. Well, sort of the same type of thing. Like, what are sort of the business metrics that we want to drive? One of my favorite is proactive hunting. And we talked about this a little bit in the manifesto, where what you're instead of just doing incident resolution or sort of preempt hunting like the adversaries. The people have these red teams, where their full-time job is to attack. They are attackers. They are cyber securities or hackers, basically, and their job is to just constantly attack their own infrastructure. And along with that, you start understanding the adversary patterns, and then sort of the round the 5 up, you have continuous detection and response, which is really just saying that security needs to have a holistic approach integrated with all this sort of other approaches like development, operations, and now we talk about SRE and those things. So those are the principles. So then the question becomes why? And obviously, security, we must have why. But what's the real why right now? Beyond sort of the headlines, right? And so how do we do that? We start with a headline. So Mark Andreessen, famous VC, but famous for a lot of other reasons, in 2011 said software is eating the world, right? And this has been true, right? There's a software explosion, and really what's sort of rounding up to be this decade has been probably starting more closer to like 2007, 2008, has just been explosive. But when I started really looking at DevOps or security under the lens of DevOps, i.e. what we've been calling DevSecOps, I got to interact with a lot of sort of lifetime security, white hat security people who are really, really worried. Not that we could stop the train, like open source and the software abstractions, that train has left the station, but that are we paying attention to what they would say software is infecting the world, right? And it's not a negative against open source and all the positive things that are going on. It's just an awareness opportunity that I started getting sort of hearing and as I interview people. And if you look at Sonatype has this, every year they do a software supply chain, the state of the software supply chain report. So 2018, I documented some of their findings. And so if you look at what Andreessen was saying in 2000, this is basically downloads for Java components. And so they look, as this report looked at Maven Central, right, which is really most of the sort of Java activity. And in 2011, there was 6 billion downloads of Java components, and in 2017, 87 billion. And in fact, the 2019 report says that the Java components are hovering around 150 billion. So this is exponential growth, right? And by the way, from their data, they say that 10% of all of those sort of that open source componentry, the Java components, are vulnerable, have vulnerabilities in it. And in fact, if you look at Node or JavaScript, basically you have like a 50%, at least from their data. And in fact, 2-year growth of Node is about 109% growth, where Java is 81%. And one last, since I'm throwing numbers at you, 71% over the last year, this is from the 2019 supply chain report, 71% of all incidents, breach incidents, were related to open source software. Again, this isn't an indictment of open source software. It's an indictment of how we have to significantly change the way we manage software and software delivery. Just staying on the scare train here, I won't go through all this. Everybody probably remembers the Target breach, the Home Depot breach. Anybody that was in the military, anybody who's ever been in the military or worked in the military or any government agency in 2015 pretty much was sort of vulnerable. And then there's the world famous Equifax breach in 2017, $5 billion market cap loss, still hundreds of millions of loss even as they recouped that data. So and more recently we've had the Equifax breach early this year, right? So it's just the train keeps continuing. And what's interesting when we talk about the Equifax breach, in that same report, a year later, a year after, like you got to remember, Equifax, for anybody who was paying attention, was on CNN. It was basically on really, you couldn't sort of be a citizen of the U.S. and not know that there was something happened. You might not even have been in IT, but you knew there was something happened with Equifax. But the people who manage software 12 months later are still downloading 80,000 copies of the vulnerable Struts 2 that had already been patched for a year. And again, you couldn't use the larger sort of megaphone pronounce how dangerous this was. This was the way they classify NIST, National Institute of Standard Technology, classifies the categories of vulnerabilities, CVEs, and this was the highest. This was a 10. This Struts 2 vulnerability. Then the Marriott breach. Again, the thing that was interesting in Marriott breach, same kind of numbers, big deal, but that last line, the adversaries were in Marriott for 4 years, according to Kroll.com. 4 years, right? That's the other thing is the adversaries are so sophisticated now. There's this notion of a kill chain that that they get in and they're willing to take a long time. They look at this, the long play, right? The long con, if you will. In fact, there's a story about a Node event module that there was some adversary that knew they were. This I believe it was last year, maybe early this year, probably last year. Again, I'm sorry for not knowing the specifics. But basically, what happened was this adversary knew there was a Bitcoin operator that actually used a specific mode. They spent a year getting trusted to where they got commit authority. And then once they got commit authority, they put in some malware inside of the module that they knew the Bitcoin operator and was able to compromise the Bitcoin operator. I mean, this is the game, right? And there's another great report called the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. And in 2018, this is really scary. They said that that 87% of known compromises happen, or the compromise happens in less than a minute. Took a couple of minutes or less than a minute. And only 3% of organizations that were compromised discover that quickly, right, within minutes. Whereas 68%, 2/3, go undiscovered for months, right? And again, these adversaries are getting in, infecting your organization, And again, so DevSecOps is a conversation to have around how do we sort of catch up, be better at this. And so how do we do this? So probably a first principle would be thinking about security as part of the classic, sort of delivery, CI/CD supply chain, continuous delivery. This was a 2006 Agile conference slide that was used to describe this sort of what, imagine 2006, about this idea that you build sort of these gates into your software delivery process. So you check in some code and it's like green, 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 red, go back. Fix it, green, 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 red, go back. And so over time, you create this resilience. So the idea of putting sort of a security abstraction alongside of that. So we talk about shift left. So how about shift left security as well? And so if you look at, I just picked some products. These are not really recommendations. I just wanted to make the point that when we talk about sort of DevOps in a supply chain, we typically have products in each one of them. If we have many products, but I just wanted to keep it simple. In each one of these sort of stages of the pipeline, right? So, the notion of shift left is you have things sort of, there's always something in the left to sort of use to sort of automate or sort of, build in that automation or correction or detection, right? And so, but in security, is probably early as 2018 or 2017, like a lot of shops are sort of disjointed here. They don't, they have pockets of security in the pipeline, but they don't think of it as a holistic view. Like in DevOps today, we look at the stages and we're pretty comprehensive about like filling in all the gaps of a pipeline for software, but we're still, a lot of organizations really don't think of the security. There's sort of bolt on, well, you must have vulnerability scanning, you must have this, but there isn't sort of, and again, DevSecOps is this opportunity to sort of think about, all the things that you would definitely want to do alongside with all the things you're already doing in DevOps. And so, if you look all the way to the left, even at sort of requirements and design, you would have training and security requirements and threat models even in design, bringing in policy SMEs to the requirements and design stories, plugins that have, IDE plugins that give you security alerts. In the build, fail fast for like all things, SaaS, DaaS. And again, these are things I really want to cover in this SIG, like expand on. Configuration management. We get into Kubernetes and Docker and YAML files. There's a whole new attack vector of like miscommerce or forgetting to put a field in that turns global security off or on. And there's a ton of really good stuff there. And then all the way to the right, your classic sort of automated pen testing, security monitoring, runtime configuration, particularly runtime configuration for containers, all those good things. And then also, one of the areas that I've been really interested in is, obviously DevSecOps as applies to the supply chain. I think we're getting pretty mature at a pretty fast pace. In OpenShift, we've done some great things there, and I want to keep exploring what more we can do, for sort of DevSecOps as it applies to OpenShift. But the area that I'm really been interested in over the last years is sort of what I'm sort of loosely calling cloud native GRC. GRC standing for governance, risk, and compliance, right? Or this notion of automated governance, right? And so this idea that a lot of what we do, a lot of part of our sort of policy, our sort of governance, our risk and compliance comes down to sort of policy that gets implemented, and then we use sort of audits to sort of show that we're actually sort of complying, with our sort of compliance definitions or sort of overall governance for how we want to do business. And in most operations today, most organizations, financials, insurance, they use what I call subjective attestation. So an attestation is the evidence of the thing that you're sort of trying to prove. And so in most organizations today, it's a ServiceNow or it's a remedy ticket, and it's sort of Bob explaining what the change is going to look like in our ticket. Sue maybe on a change advisory board or an approver looks at it and then says, well, I think you need to explain this a little more. it's kind of actually silly at that point because these are complex systems we're dealing with, and humans actually can't actually comprehend the complexity of the changes. But we sort of build this telephone game of, then somebody from production basically says, well, I'll approve this. What's your backup plan? And then what does the auditor do? The auditor comes in once a year for like 30 days and looks at change records. And so the idea is that that's such a broken model, right? Especially as we move to cloud native, we move to sort of really fast, moving technologies, and our policy definitions don't even match. So this idea of, well, we need to build these attestations into objective attestations. So these become like tokens or hashes as we do the things in the pipeline that qualify for the policy. And so with the intent of, and we've got some companies or banks already doing this, where in order to, the idea would be turn a 30-day audit into a half-a-day audit. Turn the true efficacy of an audit from maybe 10% to 90%. Because they look at basically a list of hashes that are immutable. It's mathematics. And they don't really have to sort of ask a whole lot of questions to different people about, Bob, why did you say this? Can you show me the screen print? Right, so this is a really exciting area, and I worked on an ebook with a bunch of large organizations that's published. So I'll be writing something up about that as well. And then finally, just I think it's the kitchen sink, right? We're going to call it DevSecOps because that's a good sort of placeholder. We don't need really argue about the name that's been done over. So really, let's talk about like sort of first principles as I described. Automated governance or cloud native and governance and policy, and how do those two fit? And then really sort of kitchen sink, zero trust, adversary analysis. Incredible opportunities here to sort of understand, collaborate on sort of adversaries, who they are, how they get in. There's Shannon. Again, you can tell I'm a big fan of Shannon Leitz, but like she talks about having metrics for her DevSecOps called like adversary retention rates. Watching how often they come, identifying who they are, which is incredibly interesting, but then also identifying how long they come to the site and how long they stay. And if you're doing techniques and putting like shift left criteria in, are they staying less and going somewhere else? Data science, let's science the heck out of this. Not just sort of, again, I don't want to make fun of data science or ML or DL. I mean, there's great stuff there, but like where it gets really interesting to me is when you're doing sort of ML, machine learning, to actually identify who an adversary is because you're pulling data from all these different places. That gets really interesting. Data operations, we took the whole movement of data ops. So like the whole objective attestation model. And then, so the other thing I think is really interesting, which is I touched on it a little bit earlier about sort of design and requirements or sort of security in ideation, right? Like we talk a lot about sort of commit to production, but like how do we sort of even move left of that? So great conversations there. So anyway, a couple of resources. We're going to have the Commons OpenShift SIG. It's a DevSecOps.html, basically the Commons OpenShift.org. And then we've set up a Google group as well to have discussions. So looking forward to sort of launching this off, and I just wanted to thank you. My name is John Willis again, and I'm a Red Hat, and I look forward to just sort of sharing knowledge in this if you all are up to it. Thanks.